Hi, everybody. My name is Severin Martinez. I'm a transportation planner with the Los Angeles Department of Transportation's Planning and Policy team. I'm the day-to-day project manager on planning for stress-free connections. And this video is a slight adaptation of a presentation that I might give to a local neighborhood council, but is more focused later in the presentation on the outreach component of this project and how we envision organizations assisting the department in facilitating community bike rides. So with that, let me get started. All right, so first, a little bit of project background, then discussing something called level of travel stress and how that informs the corridors that the department is deciding to look at as part of this project. And then in the opportunities for feedback, that's where the main focus on how organizations can help with community bike rides will happen. And then just a little bit about the next steps in this project. All right, so if there's one thing that people know about City of LA's mobility plan, is that they know that it calls for a vast network of protected bike lanes and bus lanes that will crisscross the city. It's true, these are two major pillars embedded in the mobility plan, but also included is something called the Neighborhood Enhanced Network. And that's what we see on the right-hand side here. It's one of the lesser discussed networks within the mobility plan, but one that LADOT is tasked with building out, and which we haven't really done terribly much of to date. And that's why we want to start getting it going through planning for stress-free connections. So what is a neighborhood enhanced network? The neighborhood enhanced network basically has three main characteristics. These are streets that are low traffic streets designed to discourage cut-through traffic and speeding from cars while improving access for people walking and biking. And as kind of like a bonus element, typically these corridors present opportunities to add new greenery and stormwater capture elements, and essentially creating park-like spaces in our streets. And that's kind of what we see on the right-hand side here. So we see a landscaped island that's being used to divert car traffic and prevent it from traveling on the residential street, while still maintaining access for people walking, biking, and emergency vehicles. And if we've done everything right in building out the neighborhood enhanced network, we will have created conditions that are so comfortable that people would gladly take their kids out on a bike ride, as shown on the bottom right-hand side there. So here's a snapshot of what a typical neighborhood enhanced network designation might look in a neighborhood. This is specifically for the East Hollywood Neighborhood Council general area. So obviously, we want to build out the neighborhood enhanced network, but where do we start, right? There's hundreds of miles of streets. So for the purposes of planning for stress-free connections, we are focused on what's called the Central City Subregion. This is an area defined by the MTA Metro and includes key portions of the City of LA, also includes small portions of unincorporated county. For the purposes of this project, we are not interested in the unincorporated county sections. But in 2018, the department was awarded a grant from the state that had three main elements: to identify areas with potential to increase walking and biking, work with communities to identify barriers that they face to walking and biking more in their communities, and then work to identify solutions. So the reason why we're focused on the Central City subregion is that this is a dense, transit-oriented part of the city with lots of jobs and services, where there really is some kind of embedded potential to promote more walking and biking if we make the conditions safe, pleasant, and convenient to do so. All right, so now a little bit about travel stress. So we know that we want to focus in the Central City subregion, and we know we want to focus on the neighborhood enhanced network within that area, but even that can be a little daunting to kind of start from scratch. So as part of this, we we analyzed what's called level of travel stress to kind of help further guide what corridors on the neighborhood enhanced network we want to focus on. And what level of travel stress does, it measures how comfortable or uncomfortable a street is for walking and biking. Some of the things that affect that are shown in this diagram. Things like the speed limit, how wide a street is, the number of travel lanes. Is the street flat or is it hilly? Is there parking? All these things kind of feed into what we intuitively all know. A big, fast, wide street is generally going to be less comfortable for walking and biking than a narrow, calm street. The same holds true for intersections. So even if you're traveling on what is considered a low stress street, you're likely to face barriers. And that can come in the form of the intersections that you encounter, particularly where you're crossing major streets. What a commonly encountered situation we see is depicted in the upper left corner here. You might be traveling on a comfortable street, and then when you get to the major street, you have a stop sign, but there's nothing really stopping traffic on the major street. So you're relying on kind of a gap in the traffic to get across, and that can be unreliable, uncomfortable for a lot of people. A little bit better than that might be having a marked crosswalk. You might feel a little bit more empowered to cross the street. Drivers might be a little bit more inclined to yield. But this is imperfect as well, right? Especially if you're trying to cross at night, there might be limited visibility, and you're still relying on the good nature of drivers. A little bit better than that, as depicted in the bottom left, is if there might be some kind of flashing beacon. This will reinforce to drivers that they need to stop, and having a flashing beacon has been shown to increase yielding compliance among drivers. But that too can still be a bit imperfect. You might only have a crosswalk on one side of the street. And if you're biking, there might be no formal accommodations to you. So typically what bicyclists do in a situation like this is they'll ride their bikes up to the sidewalk, push the button, and then they'll use the crosswalk across the street. Or they might dismount their bikes and walk their bikes across. An idealized situation is depicted in the bottom right corner. And here we have crosswalks on both sides of a street. You have a flashing beacon. You have a bike box, which could have a loop detector or position people to be next to a bike-oriented push button. So that way, bicyclists as well as pedestrians have a formal way of kind of commanding traffic to a stop and getting across the street safely. This should be noted that this is distinct from just adding a full plain traffic signal. We know from practice that installing full traffic signals, while they may improve the ability to cross the street, they also can promote more drivers to cut through on residential streets, because now drivers also have a reliable, safe way to get across the street. So we want to avoid that by having a crossing that is really designed and specific to people walking and biking exclusively. So what does low stress look like? We've gone into this a little bit, but just for a bit more detail, that's essentially what we see in this picture. On the right-hand side, we see a residential street with speed humps, mini traffic circles, and designated crossings across major streets. And that is in contrast to the street shown on the left-hand side, which is a very busy, wide street where very few people would feel uncomfortable walking and particularly biking. So the idea through planning for stress-free connections is to create parallel corridors that are already fairly comfortable for walking and biking, but really just reinforcing that through some additional infrastructural changes. And this is important because we know that streets with limited car traffic and slow-moving traffic tend to be more appealing for walking and biking for people of all ages and abilities compared to traveling on a busy street or even a busy street with just painted bike lanes. And then there's additional benefits: less noise and air pollution. People are more likely to see their neighbors and maybe know their neighbors. And of course, this all makes it safer and more accessible. So what have we learned from looking at level of travel stress? We've learned that intersections are the major barrier along our neighborhood enhanced network. Now, mind you, we haven't built out the neighborhood enhanced network, but just by default, much of it is fairly comfortable already. But we see that not all corridors are created equally. So shown here are 3 different streets. At the very top, we see a street with, roughly a dozen plus stressful barriers over a 2.5-mile stretch. This is in contrast to the Edgemont, New Hampshire corridor shown on the right-hand side. Already fairly comfortable, it only has 3 stressful barriers over a 4-mile stretch. And then there's streets that fall somewhere in the middle, like the street shown on the left-hand side, where there's about 3 barriers over a 1-mile stretch. So from a resource perspective, if we have limited dollars to invest in active transportation, we might get the most bang for our buck by investing in the corridors like Edgemont, New Hampshire, which already is fairly comfortable and just needs a few minor interventions to make it more usable and accessible. So opportunities for feedback. So we've defined in several different geographies. Shown here is what we're calling the Central LA geography, is a draft map of some preliminary corridors of interest: Edgemont, New Hampshire, St. Andrews Place, 4th Street, and James M. Wood Boulevard. And for some areas, we've also included pop-up surveys at specific intersections, and these are locations where people walking or biking by can scan a QR code or follow the URL shown on the screen and go to a survey specifically for a specific location. Here's a couple in the East Hollywood area. So if somebody's passing by the intersection of Edgemont and Melrose, they might see the survey. They can let us know more about how this intersection is, if it's comfortable, uncomfortable, things like that. Yeah, so we ask, like, on a scale from 1 to 4, how comfortable is the street? What changes are needed to make it more comfortable? And the idea is to kind of start steering us towards solutions where we can encourage drivers to yield to people crossing, reduce pedestrian exposure to vehicles, and reduce vehicle intrusion onto residential streets. We have an online portal where people can provide us feedback, and we see here all the orange dots are locations where people have given us feedback about these spots, and that's another way to kind of help steer where we look to when we want to make investments. But then there's also something we've developed, and which we hope organizations can help us in facilitating, is something called the Connect the Green Challenge, if you will. And what this is it's a map we've made for different geographies where we've identified intersections and street segments where we want to hear more from users about the comfort at these locations. They're a mixture of places that we've identified as high stress as well as low stress. And we do that because we want to know, did we get things right with the low stress locations? Maybe people feel differently than what our data shows us. And to also validate the data for the high stress locations. So as part of this, we want to work with community organizations to facilitate major bike rides, hosting maybe 15, 20, 30 people at a time. And the value of having community organizations to help facilitate this is that we will encounter tricky situations. And ways we can handle that are to either go around some of these tricky intersections as shown in this diagram, or perhaps where appropriate, maybe corking an intersection, and that is having somebody stop in the middle of the street and allowing the rest of the group to pass through the intersection all at once, rather than having to make major diversions. We also want community organizations to help educate people along on the ride about some basic bike safety practices, things like staying out of the door zone, riding with the flow of traffic, and being mindful of traffic signals and stop signs. To date, we've done a few rounds of this Connect the Green. They've been smaller in scale, but we've conducted some of these in our geographies. And I'm just going to show here a sample of the level of travel stress as defined by our technical analysis, and then the level of travel stress as defined by people that participated in Connect the Green. So we see by toggling back and forth between these two that in general, we seem to have gotten things right. And the areas highlighted, those were locations where the user felt a greater level of stress than what we had defined. So this will help us because it tells us maybe we need to pay closer attention at these locations. Maybe we can tweak our level of travel stress methodology to account for factors that people raised at these locations. And that will overall just help steer the direction of our investments and the solutions we look to. So next steps. So we are in the process of wanting to plan and organize these community bike rides, and it would benefit greatly from having community organizations help facilitate these. So having somebody at the beginning of the pack, maybe at the back of the pack of a bike ride, to help everybody move along smoothly, and and really generate interest in these events so that we can draw from a wider audience and really expand the fold of people that are helping us plan these neighborhood enhanced network streets. And following this round of outreach, we want to facilitate workshop type settings, and this will be opportunities to discuss trade-offs and to discuss really specific solutions or specific problems that will steer us towards solutions. So things like, if people say, well, speeding is the major problem on this street, then we'll look to tools that really address speeding. Or they might say, well, cut through is the major problem, not speeding. And likewise, we can look to solutions that address cut through traffic rather than speeding, or focus accordingly. And although this is a planning grant and we don't have funds to build anything, we do believe that based on the kinds of problems that people identify, that there may be opportunities to implement relatively short-term solutions. And we see that depicted in this Google screen view. So there are things we can do with just striping and signage relatively immediately. And then as we wait for funding to make these more permanent, more aesthetically pleasing, that can happen when the funding arrives for these more kind of long-term build-outs. So we're in the middle of the outreach process right now, and that's why we are hoping to enlist the assistance of community organizations to help kind of shepherd us through this. And then we'll be following that up with the conceptual feedback and workshops. And then beyond that, we're going to be developing a report to the City Council and start going after funding to build all this out. And with that, I thank you for watching this video and look forward to working with your organizations to help us facilitate community outreach. Thank you.